Chapter 421. Nolan walked in, pulled out a chair, and sat down. Are you still not feeling well? Maisie shook her head and asked, why did you come with Uncle Erwin? Nolan's eyes twitched. I asked him to come over. I was worried that something might happen to you, so I told Erwin. I had to be ready. Nolan, be honest, were you in Staslo because of your mother's incident? Maisie asked. Nolan paused and didn't answer, but she guessed as much. She looked down, pressed her lips together, and slowly said, I'm sorry I got you into this. Nolan held her slightly cold hand. I knew that it was a trap. They deliberately used my mother's incident to lure me over because they wanted to eliminate the Goldmans. I asked Erwin here because if anything happened to me, no one would dare touch you with him around. Maisie's heart hurt a little. He had known that it was a trap but still took the risk? Her eyes twitched. Why do you want to look into your mother's incident? Is it because? Nolan looked at her for a long while, then parted his lips. Because my mother's incident wasn't related to the de Armas. Maisie paused, looking surprised. How did you find out that it wasn't related to the de Armas? Even Titus had been under the impression that the de Armas had done it, and when she had mentioned this to Hernandez, he didn't explain. He loathed the Goldmans. Nolan looked calm. Rowena said that she worked with them. The de Armas took the fall for what happened all those years ago. It was obvious that Daniel Kent was the one who had lured him. The Kents were from the left-wing party. The de Armas had left the Royals for many years. So if the de Armas really were responsible for what happened those years before, they would have said something about it. Furthermore, Maisie was Hernandez's granddaughter and Nolan's wife. Hernandez was in Zlokova at that time, and they chose a time when Hernandez wasn't in Staslo to do it. This proved that the de Armas were definitely framed all those years ago. Maisie suddenly remembered something. By the way, there's something that I find odd. Nolan squinted, interested in what she was about to say. Maisie pondered over it. When Sir Hernandez asked Louis to see me, he told me that your great-grandfather was the one who turned his back against them first by cutting one of his legs and killing his father. Later on, when your grandfather came to see me, I asked him about it. He said that your great-grandfather really did hold Hernandez hostage. But he let him go. When he let him walk, his legs were still fine. Nolan's eyes darkened. At that moment, Erwin appeared outside the room. Am I interrupting? Nolan slowly got up, tidied up his suit, and turned to look at him. Mr. Erwin. Please help me take care of Z. He turned around and patted Maisie's head before he walked out. Was this man treating her like a child? Erwin walked in when he saw Nolan had left. Z, are you all right? Maisie shook her head. I was lucky that Nolan got there quickly. She remembered something and asked, Uncle Erwin, do you know those people? Erwin walked to the window. Yes, they work for the Kents. They're the most powerful allies to the Staslo Royals. They're nobles, just like the de Armas. Chapter 422. Maisie got up and slowly walked to him. Can you tell me about them? Ah. Rowena collapsed on the floor covered in blood after being whipped. Her skin split open, each wound deep and shaking. She raised her head with dried lips to stare at the man vaping on the chair. Mr. Kent. I really didn't lie to you. I didn't know how Maisie was related to the metropolis. Daniel let out a puff of smoke, his eyes piercing. I tried so hard to get Nolan into my trap. I was so close to catching him. Rowena's lips and teeth were trembling. Daniel put down his leg, got up, and walked toward her with his long legs. He looked down at the woman who was lying on the floor in bad shape. It's all because of you. You messed up my plan because you didn't check on that woman? Rowena raised her hand to tug at his pants. Mr. Kent. I'm sorry, give me another chance. I can fix this. I'll do anything. Haha. Danielle squatted down and grabbed her hair, tugging at her scalp. It hurt, but she didn't dare make a sound. He forced her to look at him. "Anything?" Danielle said to the man with the whip. "Bring that thing out." The man nodded, turned, and left the room. That thing? Rowena had a bad feeling. Daniel was happy when he saw her eyes filled with terror. "Don't worry, it's not for you. You don't deserve anything so valuable." The man walked in with a silver box with a fingerprint lock. Daniel unlocked it with his finger. The box slowly opened, and something slowly rose from inside. It was a tube with something blue in it. It looked clear and delicate. Daniel held the blue tube in his hands and looked at her. "Do you know what this is?" Rowena shook her head. "This is a beautiful yet deadly item. Once it's broken and the thing inside comes in contact with skin, the infection will begin." Rowena's pale face looked even paler. After years of living in Staslo, she had heard about that, but that was from over 30 years ago. She didn't expect that the epidemic in Staslo those years ago hadn't been an accident but caused by people. Seeing how scared she was, Daniel smiled. "Don't worry. This is the last of this deadly item, and there are no long antidotes for it. Once infected, the only thing to do is to wait for death to come. It won't even be detected at the hospital." "Mr. Kent, what do you want me to do with that?" Rowena's lips trembled. Daniel took out a normal syringe. Put on gloves, extracted some blue liquid from the tube's opening, and later sealed it. He squatted in front of her again and showed the syringe to her while smiling sinisterly. "You better make sure that Nolan is infected. If you fail, I'll cut off your head and throw it into River Xena." At the hospital. After Erwin recounted about the past, Maisie was stunned. Even the epidemic that had broken out after the incident with the Princess of Staslo was to make the people hate her and force her to renounce her right to the throne. Chapter 423. The Princess of Staslo was respected by the people in Staslo and was once known as the princess who was the most down-to-earth. She had a lot of influence and was great with business. King Miller had said that her ability to rule would not be lesser than his son's. Unfortunately, this princess who loved her country and people had fallen from grace because she fell in love with Patrick Goldman, who didn't have the same social standing. This fall from grace had been the start of the internal conflict among the royals. The royal family was split into two groups. One group of nobles, including the current Kents, supported Prince Roger, the younger half-brother of the princess. They were known as the left wing. The other group supported the princess. The princess incident had been an internal conflict. And the relationship between Patrick and the princess had given the lefties a reason to oppose her ruling. After that, an epidemic had broken out, and the people's love for the princess started to waver. But without Patrick, the princess would have been controlled and killed by the lefties. Patrick was not the ruthless killer that the lefties portrayed him as. The blood on his hands was not from the innocent. Erwin slowly turned around, his eyes stopping on Maisie's face. The lefties want to attack the Goldmans because half of the royal bloodline courses in them. They want to eliminate the Goldmans to be safe. Maisie's lips moved. "What about the de Armas?" Erwin walked to her. The de Armas used to be part of the left wing, but when Patrick used Hernandez as a hostage to force the Count to back out from the conflict, the de Armas didn't pick a side. After the Count's accidental death, Hernandez no longer took part in anything between them. Maisie thought about it and coldly said, "Would the lefties cause the thorn in the relationship between the de Armas and the Goldmans?" What Hernandez had said hadn't been caused by Patrick's side. If Hernandez and Titus hadn't lied, then there could be three outcomes from that incident. If someone was aware that Patrick had kidnapped the young Hernandez, someone might have taken advantage of the chance when Patrick let Hernandez go and pinned it on the Goldmans. If the de Armas really were not involved, then it would be as Nolan suspected. The de Armas had been framed for his mother's accident 15 years ago, just like how Daniel Kent had used Rowena as bait to lure Nolan. Even if she died, it would have been pinned on the Goldmans. Using the hatred between the two families and adding fuel to the fire, the de Armas had become a pawn in the elimination of the Goldmans. Erwin smiled. Maybe. Uncle Erwin, there's something that you haven't told me. You kept saying later, or when I'm stronger. Was it related to this too? Maisie asked calmly. Maisie had never thought much about it before learning of her mother's background. However, she slowly realized that things weren't as simple, be it the relationship between Goldmans and the Royals or even Erwin's background. He had never told her about himself because he was worried that she couldn't help and become another pawn. Erwin didn't admit nor deny that. If you didn't have anything to do with Nolan, I might have told you earlier. Chapter 424. Erwin looked at Maisie. Hernandez probably thought the same. If he knew that Ms. Marina had a daughter, he would have taken you back. Hernandez isn't dumb. He knows that the lefties may use you because of this relationship. Maisie looked surprised. But she remembered what Hernandez had told her. You're Marina's daughter, so I won't lay a hand on you even if I'm going to get revenge on the Goldmans. However, I'm not sure about the others. The others that he meant were the lefties. Something flashed across her mind after she was quiet for a while, and she looked straight at Erwin. There's one more thing. Erwin looked curious, but he saw her calmly ask, was my mother's infection related to the virus? The air in the room froze. After a long time, Erwin lowered his face and quietly said, yes. He looked out the window. Her infection was due to a rare sleeper virus that was related to the epidemic from 30 years ago. Your mother was one of the infected. The epidemic 30 years ago? Maisie mumbled because she had seen the report on the posters and started suspecting. Erwin knew there was no way for him to hide this from her any longer since she was now a target. As long as she was still in Staslo, those people would have a chance to attack. Your mother was a volunteer. There were hundreds of infected in Xena at that time, and that wasn't the first outbreak. Other than the outbreak from the Princess incident, the outbreak from 30 years ago was the second one. She was shocked. The Princess was Erwin nodded. Do you think the Royals would tell the world that the Princess passed because of a virus? Obviously not. The Princess had been infected, so the Royals claimed that she died due to sickness. Maisie was quiet. Even though she hadn't been born yet at that time, they learned about these historical events in school. The epidemic that had broken out when the Princess was around was worse than the one from 30 years ago. Almost half the population of Staslo had been wiped out. More than 390,000 people had died. There would have been a riot if the Royals had announced the real cause of the Princess' death. The later epidemic had infected more than 1,000 people. Some people had received really good treatments, and only a dozen died. Based on what the people were saying, the epidemic 3 years ago had been controlled because a vaccine was found. During the Princess time, the outbreak had been due to the lack of a vaccine. If there was a vaccine, then why would my mother the vaccine could only control, but not cure, Erwin cut her off. The sleeper virus wouldn't show symptoms at the early stages of the infection, just like rabies. They both have an incubation period of up to a year. If the infected were able to get a vaccine in the first few months, it could be under control, and they would possibly recover. So my mother, Maisie paused. Erwin answered calmly, your mother realized that she was infected a year after the epidemic. She went to Morwich because Strix was the only one who had a solution. If she hadn't headed to Morwich, she wouldn't have survived long enough to give birth to you. Strix had always been keeping the virus under control and even developed an antibody serum. Chapter 425. Unfortunately, it was too late. Your mother was in the final stages and didn't have much longer to live, so she chose to leave. However, when she left, Strix gave her the antibody. There were only 2 in the world, and he gave one to your mother and kept the other. I think your mother injected the serum before she decided to get pregnant. Otherwise, your father would have been infected too, and you. Erwin looked at her but didn't continue. Maisie's heart shuddered. So that's why my blood is special? Marina had decided to inject herself with the serum when she was pregnant, even though the serum wouldn't have worked for her. Thus, Marina had done it because she didn't want to infect Steven and wanted to ensure that Maisie wouldn't inherit the virus. Had she made her decision long ago to try and leave without regrets? But why hadn't she chosen her first love, Strix, and instead married Steven, who she had just met? Maisie, remember I told you not to let anyone know about your unique blood condition? Erwin reminded her. Maisie nodded and was curious. Erwin told her, the virus would not infect you, and the sleeper virus outbreak wasn't a natural occurrence. People caused it. Maisie returned to the hotel and was still confused. Sherry saw that she didn't look well when she picked her up. So? She worriedly asked, are you all right? Yes. Maisie squeezed out a smile. The Sheena jewelry show had ended. Maisie had missed the verdict because she left halfway through, but she was no longer concerned about how it turned out. When they got back to the hotel, she took a shower. With Erwin's words still lingering in her mind. The outbreak of the sleeper virus was man-made. Who would have developed such a crazy, scary thing while ignoring the lives of many? She left the shower room in a robe and heard someone knocking. She went to open the door while drying her hair with a towel. When she saw who was outside, she happily jumped into his arms. Nolan looked at the woman in his arms and smiled helplessly. Have you had dinner? Not yet. Where did you go? Maisie looked at him. To get some things sorted. Nolan walked in and closed the door. Seeing how his pretty little wife was hanging on to him and smelling great after her shower, he raised his brows and carried her to the couch. She sat on his thighs. Maisie put her arms around his neck. What did you do that took so long? Nolan's hands were behind her waist. He played with the strap of her robe but still looked serious. Missing me after just half a day? Maisie laughed but didn't deny it. Didn't you know that distance makes the heart fonder? Nolan squinted while his lips curled. If you miss me that much, how are you going to show it? Maisie blushed. Your hands are already all over me. Where? He smiled and continued. He looked happy, his eyes playfully teasing her. But he still sat there, unmoving. He finally stopped when he saw her curl up in his arms and said in his low, sultry voice, Aren't you the one taking advantage of me now? Chapter 426. Maisie gasped and hissed. You really have done it. Nolan. After a long while, Maisie started to tidy herself up. Nolan chuckled. He then helped Maisie to put on her clothes and said, You're getting better and better, Z. It seems like I've taught you well. Yeah. Do you feel proud? Maisie said, and her cheek puffed like a pufferfish. This man was getting more and more shameless. He even started to do that thing to her. Seeing that Maisie was starting to put on a show of bad temper, a flicker of affection crossed Nolan's eyes. People said that a woman would only start to become clingy and behave in a spoiled manner when she fell in love with a man, and he did see those criteria in her. He held her in his arms contentedly and said in a low voice, All right. I found something today. Rowena knew that my mother was abducted. Maisie was stunned. So she didn't tell your grandfather? Nolan's eyes turned cold as he replied, She didn't tell anyone, including my grandfather and the people in the night banquet. She pushed all the blame to Hernandez. Maisie fell silent. She thought of Rowena's face when she had been taken away today. It seemed as if she was asking for help from Nolan, and she appeared as if she was not completely loyal to Daniel. Could it be that Daniel was threatening her with something? That being said, Maisie would not sympathize with Rowena. She had crossed the line of being a person after everything she did. It was said that one would reap what they sowed, so she deserved it. When Nolan heard her stomach was gurgling, he froze for a moment before breaking into laughter. Maisie's face turned red with embarrassment. She pitched her voice low and said, "It's all your fault. I told you I'm hungry, but you wouldn't let me eat." Chuckling, Nolan comforted her. All right. It's my fault. To make up for it, I'll take you to dinner." Nolan brought Maisie to an outdoor restaurant with a romantic ambience near the amusement park in his car. There were a lot of foreigners in the restaurant, and both of them stood out a lot. The amusement park nearby was very lively. A huge and towering Ferris wheel rose from the ground and added a tint of color to the night sky. "Nolan, let's ride the Ferris wheel after we finish our dinner," Maisie said as she pointed at the Ferris wheel. Then, she pouted and added, "I've never ridden a Ferris wheel before. Since I'm here in Staslo, it would be a great loss if I didn't get to play anything." After all, she had not had a lot of chances to go to the amusement park in the past. Since she was here, she figured that she shouldn't miss it. Nolan chuckled and replied, "Sure." After they finished their dinner, they went to the amusement park. The amusement park was bustling with people, and a lot of things were going on. There was a clown holding balloons of different colors in his hand. And several children that looked like dolls surrounded him asking for them. Holding Nolan's hand, Maisie walked toward the Ferris wheel. After Nolan bought the tickets, both of them rode the Ferris wheel. When the Ferris wheel was rising, Maisie looked down through the window. Her eyes were lit with excitement as the things outside were getting smaller and smaller in her vision. Nolan sat with his back straight across her, and every smile on her face was reflected in his eyes. In his opinion, she was far more fascinating than the view outside the window. Maisie turned her head around and rammed into his gaze. Then, she chuckled and said, "I've heard that lovers who ride the Ferris will always end up going separate ways." When she saw that Nolan's face suddenly turned dark, she rose to her feet and walked up to him. Her eyes were glowing brightly as she continued. "However, I also heard that if you kiss your partner when the Ferris wheel reaches its highest point, you will be together forever." When the Ferris wheel reached the highest point in the air, Maisie planted a kiss on Nolan's lips. Chapter 427. Nolan lowered his head, placed his hand on the back of her head, and deepened the kiss. Although this was just a symbol, a myth about the Ferris wheel, he was willing to go along with her. In the end, Maisie's face was flushed from oxygen deprivation after they had finished their long kiss. Nolan rubbed her head and laughed. "It's been so long, and you still don't know how to breathe when you're kissing?" Maisie blinked her eyes, but did not say anything. "It seems like I need to teach you again." Nolan clasped his fingers on her chin and planted another kiss on her lips. After a while that seemed like an eternity, Maisie pulled herself away from his lips. Her face was red, and she was huffing heavily. When she saw that he was going to kiss her again, she pushed him away and said, all right. I already know how." She was certain that her lips were going to swell up if they continued the kiss. When both of them came down from the Ferris wheel, a 6-year-old little boy wearing a hat pulled a rose out of his basket. He said, "Sir, your girlfriend is the most beautiful girl I've seen, but she'll become even more beautiful with roses." "Thank you. I'll get them all," Nolan said as he pulled a few notes out of his wallet. He tousled his head and added, "Keep the change." The boy handed the basket of roses to him with a smile. He gave him a bow and then went away. Nolan then gave all the roses in the basket to Maisie. Maisie held them in her arms and chuckled. "Thank you so much, Mr. Goldman, for spending so much money to buy so many roses for me." He leaned closer to her and lifted her brows. "Then, do you like it?" Maisie winked at him and said, "Well, I like roses, but I like money even more." Her eyes and face lit up when she mentioned money. Nolan did not hesitate and put his wallet in her hands. "Here. Take it. Spend all you like." Snap. Someone took a photo in the dark. In the photo, Maisie and Nolan were talking and laughing intimately. That person sent the photo to someone, and the latter replied quickly. We can't let him leave alive. Roger that. After the man had replied to the text message, he put the camera aside. He raised his hand to press the miniature Bluetooth earpiece in his ear to contact the people around. The black-clad men in the crowd looked and nodded at each other. There were a lot of things going on in the amusement park, and Maisie was having a lot of fun. She refused to go back yet, and she dragged Nolan with her whenever she saw something interesting. Nolan just stayed by her side patiently. However, he suddenly sensed something and jerked his head back, his eyes deep and cold. Just when he was about to warn Maisie that they were followed, he turned his head back and realized Maisie was gone. Damn it! Nolan wedged his way out of the crowd to look for Maisie as he made a call to Quincy. In the meantime, an explosion occurred and startled the visitors. Gone was the lively atmosphere, and chaos prevailed. All of the fleeing tourists swarmed past him. Soon, he saw a few masked armed people were coming toward them. The tourists panicked and scrambled to safety. Those who failed to escape in time found a location and hid. Suddenly, Nolan saw Maisie amongst the crowd. The basket of flowers had fallen next to her, and the roses were all trampled by the crowd. She was holding a little girl in her arms. The girl was crying. And it seemed like she was injured. Z. Chapter 428. Nolan hurriedly came to her side. Maisie was covering the little girl's wound with her hand. Her countenance was pale as she said, Nolan, she got separated from her family and is injured. We can't leave her here. I know. Go find a place and hide. What about you? Maisie tugged at him when he stood up. There are too many of them, and they're coming for you. You can't go out just like that. They will kill you. When she had been in the crowd just now, she had heard that those people were coming to take Nolan's life. Nolan kissed her and stroked the corner of her eyes with his fingertip. Don't worry. I'll be fine. Now, go hide and wait for me. Nolan got up to his feet and went away. Maisie tried to stop him by grabbing his hand, but to no avail. The little girl in her arms was crying loudly because of her injuries. Soon, Maisie turned her eyes back to the girl and comforted her. Don't worry. Nothing will happen. I'll get you out of here. Okay? The little girl stopped crying and nodded. Once again, Maisie looked toward the direction Nolan disappeared into. Gnashing her teeth, she scooped the little girl up from the ground and ran toward the fleeing crowd. The disturbance at the amusement park also alerted the police. Hundreds of people gathered outside the open space of the amusement park, and they only heaved a sigh of relief at the sight of the police. Maisie carried the injured little girl to the crowd and looked around for help. She was injured. Can you take care of her? She got separated from her parents. A pair of young couples took over the little girl and nodded. Yes, leave it to us. When Maisie turned around and was about to run back into the amusement park, the woman called out to her, Where are you going? It's dangerous there. Smiling, Maisie replied, I'm going to save my husband. After that, she turned around and ran back into the amusement park. All of the visitors in the amusement park had been evacuated. There was nothing but chaos in the amusement park right now. She could hear gunshots in the air. And she took cover behind an ice cream cart. When she was about to get out, she saw someone get shot in front of her and froze. Her face turned pale, and then she noticed the gun on the man. Gnashing her teeth, she rolled toward the man and pulled his gun out. At that moment, a masked man noticed her. Perhaps he thought she was the one who had shot his comrade and cursed, "Oh, shit." He then lifted his gun and shot at her. Maisie swiftly pounced behind the ice cream cart, causing the bullets to hit the cart and miss their targets. While she was gasping for air, she took the magazine out and took a look. There were 5 bullets. She put the magazine back and loaded the gun. Then, a gun was pointed at her head. Maisie froze. After she calmed herself down, she put the gun on the ground and put her hands in the air. Then, she explained. I didn't kill your man. I just took his gun. Slowly and carefully, she turned around to look at the masked man. She pouted her mouth pitifully and looked at him seductively. You can do anything you want. She removed her jacket, revealing her tank top inside and letting the masked man have a glimpse of her fair skin and plump breasts. She took the hairband off, causing her hair to fall down her back, further accentuating her already beautiful face. Chapter 429. The masked man fixed his bluey eyes on her body. His blood boiled while his Adam apple bobbed up and down in his throat. Seizing the chance while he was distracted, Maisie moved away from the gun and rose to her feet. Bang! He missed his target. Maisie turned to his back and strangled his neck with her arm, choking him. Her gaze was stern as she asked, "Where is Nolan?" The masked man said something, and Maisie knocked him out cold. She took his gun and continued to run inside. Meanwhile, Nolan had taken down a few masked men. All of them were shot by him and were squirming on the ground in pain. After making quick work of the last masked man, he kicked his gun away when he was reaching for it. His well-pressed suit was torn and wrinkled. There were wounds on his arms and back. And there were beads of sweat dangling off the tip of his hair. He looked like a mess, but at the same time, he looked fierce and ruthless. He stepped on the back of the man's hand and asked, "Who sent you?" The man on the floor winced in pain, and when he refused to say anything, Nolan kicked him, causing him to vomit blood. Nolan pointed the gun at him and asked, "Give you another chance. Who sent you?" The man closed his eyes as if he was waiting for his death to arrive. Bang! Nolan was stunned. He turned his head to look at the direction from which the sound of gunfire came and saw the slowly falling body of the black-clad man behind him who was about to sneak up on him with a knife. Then, he was stunned once again when he saw the person who fired the shot. Maisie slowly lowered down the pistol and looked as if she had her energy drained from her. Her hands were shaking profusely even after the man had fallen to the ground. I just killed a man. But if I didn't do it, he was going to kill Nolan. I was just saving Nolan. Yes. I was just saving Nolan, Z. Nolan ran up to her. She threw the pistol away and fell into his embrace. Her face was pale, but she forced herself to smile at him. Nolan, I'm not late, am I? Nolan held her tightly in his arms and gnashed his teeth. Are you mad? What the hell did you come back for? Maisie lifted her head to look at him and said, I don't want to leave you alone. Nolan's heart skipped a beat after he heard what she said. He secured her tightly in his embrace and planted a kiss on the top of her head. He did not know what he was going to do if he were to lose her. Rowena, who was hiding in the dark, stopped the rest of the people. She said, the police are here. We have to get out of here immediately. Bring the virus to me. The person behind her then handed her a syringe. Rowena took the syringe and looked at Nolan again. In fact, she had hesitated before. It was just all Nolan cared about was not her, but Maisie. She had been in love with him for 20 years. She looked up to him since she was a child and wanted to marry him after growing up. Unfortunately, she no longer was the little girl behind his back. He had met the woman he loved most, and that woman was not her. Rowena looked at Maisie, her gaze laced thick with hatred. She put on an insulation glove and dripped the virus in the syringe onto a bullet. Daniel had told her before that it only took one drop of this virus to the skin to start the infection. Normal gloves would not be able to protect them from the virus. Besides, this was a newly developed virus. And its effect was much quicker than the normal virus that had broken out 30 years ago. Once infected, he or she would certainly die. Rowena loaded the bullet with the virus into her pistol with shaking hands. Her eyes were bloodshot as she aimed at them. Nolan. You shouldn't refuse to love me. Nolan inadvertently lifted his head and saw an infrared ray. He grabbed Maisie into his arms and turned around, using himself as a shield to block the shot. Chapter 430. A sharp gunshot rang, and the bullet landed on Nolan's back. Maisie was stunned, and then her pupils constricted. Under the lamp, the hard lines on his face softened. The light in his eyes was slowly leaving his irises as he gazed deeply into her eyes. He lifted his hand to stroke her face, and there was a gentle smile tugging at the tip of his lips. Z. Don't worry, he lowered his head, wanting to plant a kiss on her lips. However, he slowly fell down like a marionette with its string cut when he nearly touched her lips. Maisie hurriedly grabbed his body. She realized in surprise that he was shot in the back, and hot tears began to roll from her eyes. Hugging him, she cried, "No, no. Nolan, don't sleep. I don't allow you to leave me." By the time Quincy and Sherry arrived with the police, they were stunned when they saw Maisie was crying with Nolan in her arms. Mr. Goldman, the ambulance scorched down the road at top speed. Maisie sat at the side and cupped Nolan's hands in hers, trying her very best to warm up his cold hand. When she saw that the nurses and doctor were trying to stop his bleeding, her whole body was shaking. Nolan was rushed into the operation room when they arrived at the hospital, but the doctor did not allow Maisie, Quincy, and the others to enter. Maisie watched as Nolan was pushed into the operation room. At the moment the door was closed, she paced back with faltering steps, leaned against the wall and slowly squatted down. Mrs. Sherry wanted to comfort her, but Quincy stopped her. After all, he knew comforting was useless at a time like this. Erwin rushed to the hospital when he received the news. After he talked with Quincy, he looked at Maisie, who was shrouded in a chrysalis of sadness. He walked toward Maisie, his face wearing a heartache expression. He squatted in front of her and said, "Z, you need to believe in Mr. Goldman. He's a good person, so he definitely will be fine." Maisie curled up and hugged her legs. "It's all my fault. He took the bullet for me. I should be the one lying inside there." Erwin nodded and said calmly, "I know he saved you, but now is not the time to give up yet, is it? You need to pull yourself together." Maisie was stunned, but she did not say anything. Erwin tousled her hair and said, "The floor is cold. Come, get up." Erwin helped her to her feet, and both of them then walked to the bench. After she took her seat, Erwin took off his jacket and draped it over her shoulder. "Mr. Goldman will be very upset when he comes out safely and sees you like this." Wrapped in the jacket given by Erwin, Maisie lifted her head to look at him and squeezed a smile on her face. The doctor only came out of the operation room. Draping in Erwin's jacket, Maisie stood up and approached the doctor. She grabbed his arm and asked, "How is my husband doing?" There was a mixed expression on the doctor's face. He said, "I'm sorry. We can't give you an answer yet, as the patient's condition is a little bit complicated." Seeing that Maisie's countenance began to change, the doctor added, "But don't worry, ma'am. We assure you that he'll be all right." Maisie only let the doctor's arm go after she heard what he said. "Are you sure? Can you guarantee that he'll be all right?" "Yes, ma'am. Please have faith in us." As the doctor had said, Nolan was out of danger. However, he still needed to be hospitalized in the ICU for some time, and family members were forbidden from staying with him all the time. That being said, Maisie was still worried about him. She visited him every single day, but she could only stay with him for a limited period. Nolan did not wake up. He was lying in bed and relying on a ventilator for oxygen. She would check the electrocardiogram every day, and she only felt relieved when she saw that his heart was still beating. After all, this meant that he was still alive. After she came out of the ICU, she took off the face mask and saw Erwin was talking to the doctor.